Kind of the main areas that we will go over today are completing your exit counseling requirement online. We'll look into how to view your total loan amounts, where to go to find out who your loan servicer is, and then we'll talk quite a bit about repayment and some of the different payment plan options that are out there. Well, this is a little trickier to ask, but if you've already done your exit counseling requirement, could you just put it in the chat? Maybe you're already done with it. You did it on studentaid.gov. Great, Elizabeth. It's totally okay if you haven't. I just like to ask to see where everyone's at. Great, we have a couple more coming in. Yes, Wendy, there are a lot of options. So that's, I guess, the main theme of today is not to feel overwhelmed with your exit counseling. It seems a little intimidating, and there's a lot they ask you a lot of questions. They ask you what your income's going to be and all these things, which is pretty intimidating, especially because you all technically haven't even graduated yet. But it's really not all it's cracked up to be, and we'll dive into that a little more as we go on here. So, need to switch screens. Okay, and there should now be a presentation that you all can see. So before we dive into some of the exit counseling items, I'd like to go over a few specifics of the CARES Act that was passed a few months back and how it relates to your student loans and your young adult lives as you leave UVA. So the CARES Act was signed into law at the end of March. What it's best known for is kind of providing the economic stimulus package to Americans. We've all heard of the stimulus checks and that kind of thing. But it also had quite a few provisions for students with federal loans. And I'll go over some of the main ones with you all right now, and I'll explain which ones are relevant to you and which ones aren't so relevant to you at this point in time. But all federal loans are included in the CARES Act. So if you're unfamiliar, I'll briefly talk about the three main types of federal loans that there are. Your subsidized and unsubsidized loans are primarily for undergraduates, and the difference between the two is that subsidized loans do not accrue interest while you're in school, and unsubsidized loans do. Parent Plus loans or Grad Plus loans, if we have any graduate students in this meeting, they are similar to unsubsidized loans in that they accrue interest while you're in school. The difference, though, is that Parent Plus loans can be taken out on a parent's behalf instead of the students, and then they're required to make the repayments. So what the CARES Act did was it set interest rates on all federal loans to 0% from March 13th until September 30th, 2020. So this is relevant for you all because that means starting on March 13th, any unsubsidized or any Graduate Plus loans you had essentially stopped accruing interest because the interest rates were set to 0%, and they will stop accruing interest up until September 30th, 2020. At that point, they will go back to whatever they were before. It's usually around 5% interest is kind of the average on federal student loans. And this bullet point isn't really relevant to you all since you're not in repayment yet, but if you were, payments were automatically suspended during the same time frame. And if you make a payment between March 13th and September 30th, you can get a full refund at no penalty to you. Any payment made during the March 13th to September 30th window will be fully applied to interest before it goes to the principal. This is a little different from how regular loan payments work. Regular loan payment will pay off a portion of the interest and a portion of the principal. But paying off the interest is really important due to something called capitalization, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Payments during this time will still count towards income-driven repayment, public service loan forgiveness, and loan rehabilitation. We'll also talk a little more about what these things mean in just a second. And if you're interested in more information on the CARES Act and things that the government is doing during this time, here's the link that you all will be able to check out after the presentation. It's very possible that more legislation gets passed between now and September 30th, but it's still a little too early to tell. So it's certainly possible that maybe the period of 0% interest gets extended or something like that, but we're just not sure yet. So I'll pause for a second now, and if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. This is just some general information about the CARES Act. Right. So I'm going to move now into more of the exit counseling and repayment type items. So a common question maybe some of you have are, when will I start making student loan payments? All federal loans come with a 6-month grace period after graduation before repayment is required. So what that means for you all is, as spring 2020 graduates, you won't be required to make a payment until a little before Thanksgiving. Usually the middle to the end of November 2020 is when you'll actually enter repayment. So you'll have the next 6 months to kind of get your life in order before you are forced to make any payments. And like I said earlier on the CARES Act, the period of not making any payments might be extended. So we had a question come through, what is graduation considered for UVA? So the date used is when your degree was conferred upon you by the registrar's office. I believe this year that is Saturday, May 16th. And so that means the clock starts the day your degree is conferred upon you, and then you'll have 6 months from that date. You can make payments during your grace period if you want to. It's really helpful to do. We'll talk about that in just a second, about why. And that's because of capitalization. So if you have the ability to pay off interest that has accrued while you're in school before your grace period runs out, please do so. There's a little example that I'll put up on the screen here to show you why. So let's say you had $5,000 in student loans each year at an interest rate of 5%. Over 4 years of being in school, you'll accrue a little less than $3,000 in interest. If you don't pay off that interest before your 6-month grace period runs out, it will capitalize, which means this $2,937 gets added to your total, and then your total loan balance looks like $22,937. So what that means is, if you don't pay off the accrued interest, you'll end up paying $31 extra a month once you're in repayment. If you're able to pay off that interest and you avoid capitalization, as you can see down here, you'll save over $800 over the life of the loan, which saves you money and makes it to where your loans are paid off sooner. Do we have any questions about capitalization or starting repayment? Yes, Brian, there is absolutely a possibility for the grace period to be extended. It's just a little too early for anyone to know what's going on. There are a couple bills out there that have kind of student loan legislation in them, but it's impossibly too early to tell. But that's a great question. Ellie, yes, please. Well, actually, so I misread your question. Your subsidized loans, yes, you can make payments on any loan during the grace period. It will not hurt you at all. It can only help you. Grace, that's a really great question. So I'm assuming all of you have the chat box open, right? Can we kind of see these questions as they're coming in? Okay, thank you. So Grace, in a second here, I'll show you, once you find out who your loan servicer is, or you might already know, you'll make an account with that company, and then you can log in and see your exact loan amounts. It'll show you how much interest has been accrued. It will show you the principal amount of your loans. And if you go to make a payment during your grace period, you can, some companies have like a comment box. You can say, please pay the full amount to interest. Some companies, if you make the payment before the grace period runs out, it automatically goes to your interest. So it's a little different on a case-by-case basis, but it becomes pretty clear once you make an account with your loan servicer. Yes, the 6-month grace period does apply to Grad PLUS loans, all federal loans. And Ellie, I know I covered this, but yes, you can make payments at any time, even right now, if you wanted to. Any more questions on repayment? Oh, that's a really good question. I don't really have an answer for you. My initial thought would be to contact your loan servicer, which we'll still go over in a second. There isn't any official regulations for students who have had job offers rescinded. I'm not even sure if it's something that's on the radar in Washington, but there are kind of protections in place to help with things like unemployment once you've entered repayment. That's called deferment. We'll talk about that in a second, but my initial thought would be to contact your loan servicer. Right. So Nick, if you can see in this little scenario, so theoretically, your whole time in school, you'd accrue a little less than $3,000 in interest. So on your $20,000 in loans. So if you can pay that $2,937 off when you hit repayment 6 months after graduation, you'll really only owe the $20,000. It gets a little tricky when you don't pay off the accrued interest, and then the principal looks a lot larger and then accrues more interest because the loan looks bigger. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. Oh, Wendy, so the capital interest will kick in 6 months after graduation when you enter repayment. So if you can pay off accrued interest on unsubsidized or Grad PLUS loans before your 6-month grace period runs out, that's a really great idea to do. All right, so there are 8 repayment plan options in total, divided into 3 main categories. We won't talk about all 8 repayment plan options. We'll talk more just about the 3 main categories, and then I'll show you where you can do a little more research on them. So you have your standard repayment, which comes with one flat payment every month for 10 years. If you choose standard repayment, you'll pay the lowest total interest over time. There's graduated repayment, where your payments will start lower at first and will increase every 2 years, but will never exceed the standard repayment amount. So that's one really important thing to keep in mind with all of these payment plan options. You will never, ever be required to pay more than what the standard plan repayment would be for you. And in a second, we'll do an example so we can really see what that looks like. With the graduated repayment plan, you would pay more in total interest over time because your payments are starting out lower at the beginning. Sometimes this is a good plan for students who are a little unsure of what their plans are after graduation, or maybe they know they're taking a slightly lower paying job right out of graduation, but they feel like in 3 or 4 years they're going to be making a lot more money. Sometimes that graduated repayment plan is a good option in those scenarios. And then you have quite a few what are known as income-based repayment plans. So how these work, the monthly payments are based on 10% of your discretionary income. So this number is decided by your taxes. So every year you would have to report how much money you made the previous year, right, when you file your taxes with the IRS, and then your loan servicer will determine what your payment will be for that year. These programs, your payments can increase or decrease from year to year, and you'll pay more total interest over time. And then this link at the bottom is where you can go to do a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the repayment plans. But are there any questions about those three? If you've already done your exit counseling, I know a few of you said you had, the end result of exit counseling is that you have to pick a repayment plan. And that's part of the reason why it looks a little intimidating. But what they don't tell you is that you can actually change your repayment plan at any time. There's no penalty, there's no fee. You just have to tell your loan servicer that you'd like to change your repayment plan. Okay, so right, so you actually wouldn't, and I'll plug that in to the simulation in a second, Wendy. So if everyone can see Wendy's question, so out of these 8 plans, not every person will be eligible for all 8 plans. There are different kinds of loans that are eligible for certain repayment. Some of the repayment plans, you have to have a certain amount of loans. Like there are a couple payment plans that you only qualify for if you have more than $30,000 in federal loans. And so, so Wendy, I'll kind of plug that scenario into a simulator here in a second. Yes, Yuri, really great question. You can absolutely pay more than the standard repayment plan. You can always make additional payments, even if you're on any of these plans. Let's say you pick the graduated plan and maybe you're paying $100 a month. You can go in your account anytime and make extra payments if you'd like to. Okay, 2 questions that just came in. So a couple questions. Do you have to disclose this to your service loan provider? Well, they'll kind of know because you're making a payment on their account. So let's say your loan servicer is Sallie Mae. You know, you'll have an account with Sallie Mae. You'll make your regularly scheduled payment every month. And then if you go in maybe bi-weekly and make another payment, they'll know. But it's not like they're going to raise your rates or raise your payments or something like that, if that's what you're asking about. If you complete exit counseling for your undergrad loans, no, absolutely not. It will not affect your ability to get graduate loans at all. And in fact, if any of you are going to graduate school next year, you do still need to complete your exit counseling requirement. Your loans will be automatically deferred once you enroll in grad school in July or August. But you do still need to just go through and complete the process. And Wendy, this one gets a little tricky. There can be a penalty fee for paying off early. If you're on the standard plan and pay your loans off early, there is no fee. If you're on some of the other plans, and I would encourage you to look at them in a little more detail at this link at the bottom of the page. But if you qualify for loan forgiveness, or if you're on some of the other plans and pay them off early, some of the interest that you kind of miss out on can be considered taxable income. But it gets a little tricky. So I guess the easy answer is if you're on the standard plan, no. If you are looking for loan forgiveness or on another plan, the answer is maybe. And you can find out the details a little more on the repayment plan page. Any more questions about the main repayment plan options? All right. So let's try, we'll do a simulation here. So this is a fantastic resource. Some of you may have already stumbled upon it if you've been on the student aid website, but they have a loan simulator. And let me see. And we should now be able to see the loan simulator on the Federal Student Aid website. So at the beginning, there's a couple different options that it gives you. I want to find the best repayment strategy. I'm struggling with my payments and I want to simulate borrowing more money. I would encourage you all to stick with one of these two right here, probably the first one for right now. And the neat thing about it is if you know your FSA ID, like what you use to log in to do the FAFSA, you can log in and it will auto-populate all of your loan totals, to the dollar amount, including interest and everything, which is a really neat feature. But for right now, we'll just do a quick start from scratch option. And on this personal information page, usually the answer is going to be none of these apply to me. But if something applies to you, then please go ahead and select that option. And what we'll do is we're going to use loan averages over the last 4 years for UVA. So we're going to go Virginia. And there's an average of all students over the last 4 years. So that's kind of just a really baseline look, just to give an example here. It will ask you if you're interested in public service loan forgiveness. I'm going to select no for right now, and we'll talk about this on another slide in just a few minutes. I'll explain it in a lot more detail. And then it'll ask you what your primary repayment goal is. So I don't know, maybe we can make this a little interactive. If anyone would like to make a suggestion in the chat, I'll pick that and we'll kind of see what it does. Lowest total amount owed, all right. And we'll view results. The standard repayment is basically always going to be the answer for lowest total amount owed. But what it would look like in this hypothetical scenario is that your monthly payment would be $179. You'd pay $21,471 total. You'd pay off your loans in April of 2030. It'll show you a graph of your payments over time where that looks a little it also gives you advantages and disadvantages. But if you scroll down, so see it, right now it populated standard repayment and graduated repayment. Someone asked a little earlier about the income-based, if you weren't working. I don't know if you remember, let me slide back and see who that was. So Wendy, if you noticed on the page where we did some personal information, there was a box you could check if you've filed taxes over the last 2 years. If the answer was yes there, you could have put in, the amount you made in taxes, and then an income-based plan would have shown up for you. But in this scenario, we would only be eligible for the standard repayment or the graduated repayment. So if you select the graduated repayment, you can see here how your payments would increase every 2 years. It'll talk about your advantages and disadvantages. But what's really different is if you look across the 2 boxes here, you're going to pay about $1,000 more in interest, and excuse me, and then you can see the range of your monthly payments there. So let's go back for a quick second. It doesn't let you go back. Oh yeah, it does. Okay. So we're going to say we are interested in public service loan forgiveness now. And we'll apply. Oh, it's not going to give. That's okay. Does anyone have questions about this loan servicer? Are there any other kind of weird scenarios you'd like to see put in there? I will still talk about the public service loan forgiveness and why that's important in just a couple minutes. All right. So we'll move on to forgiveness, and then we'll talk a little bit about consolidation and refinancing. Those are usually common questions as well. So there are 2 federal programs for student loan forgiveness. There's PSLF, Public Service Loan Forgiveness. There's a link to find out a little more about it, but I'll touch on some of the main points. You must be employed by a U.S. government organization or nonprofit organization. You must repay your loans under an income-driven repayment plan. So that was option 3 on the slide I was on a few slides back, your income-driven repayment plans. And you have to make 120 qualifying payments, 10 years. So why this is important, excuse me, if you're on this income-driven repayment plan, it's possible you might be paying, let's use the loan simulation scenario as an example. So the standard payment was $179 a month. It's possible that in your income-driven repayment plan, you might only be paying, let's say, $80 a month. So maybe $80 to $100 a month for 10 years. So what happens at that point is, let's say you're paying $80 to $100 a month for 10 years. You get to the end of the 10-year period, and then the rest of your loan principal would be forgiven. So you do still have to go through a 10-year repayment, and then it's everything after that that would get forgiven. I'm really glad that you put that in the chat, Wendy, about horror stories. You beat me by about one bullet point, I think. This program has been riddled with, I'll actually just use your words, horror stories. The program is about 12 years old, which means the first couple classes of people who are eligible for this really only surfaced in the last 2 to 3 years, because they had to go through the 10-month repayment or 10-year repayment. And over 90% of people who thought they were on track for this for one reason or another were denied. So the federal government is supposedly taking steps to simplify this process and make it better. But we always like to tell people to please, please, please do not count on this program for giving your loans. We would hate to see students take certain jobs or live in certain areas because they think that part of their loans will be forgiven. And for them to invest 10 years in that and then not have it happen is really, really disappointing. But you do have to apply. When you finish or when you go through your exit counseling and pick a repayment plan, you'll want to make sure you indicate that you're interested in the program. It'll then tell you which specific payment plans you can be on. And you'll want to make sure that your employer is, if you follow this link on the student aid website, you can find a list of employers and government agencies that qualify. But it gets really, really tricky. So, but just know that it's out there. Then there's also a teacher loan forgiveness program. This program is in a lot better shape than the public service loan forgiveness. It's much, much better. Some of the highlights are that you have to be employed as a qualified teacher for 5 complete years, employed at an elementary school, secondary school, or educational service agency that serves low-income students. And also, if you follow this link, you can find a list of qualifying schools in your particular state or area. Do we have any questions about loan forgiveness? All right.
I have a question, actually.
Oh, yeah, please.
So is the same reputation for the teacher loan forgiveness? My question is basically, does it have the same reputation for like dysfunction as the public service loan forgiveness program?
No, it is in much, much better shape. It works virtually 100% of the time. And I don't really have a good reason as to why. You'd think that, if the government already has one program in place, that the other one would work as well. But it has not, that has not been the case yet. But the government has made many promises over the last year or two that they are trying to improve how the public service loan forgiveness program works. It's just a little too early to tell if that's actually the case yet.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions on these 2 programs? One of you asked earlier if there was a penalty fee for paying off your loans early, and I mentioned if you were on one of these 2 plans, the answer is possibly. So let's say you had $50,000 in loans and you were on one of these 2 programs, and maybe at the end of your 10 years, you paid $40,000 of your loans, and there was still 10 left over. So then $10,000 were going to be forgiven. That $10,000 would be counted as income on your next year's taxes. So in that regard, there is kind of a penalty, but the amount of taxes that you'll pay on the $10,000 is far, far less than actually paying the $10,000. So I did want to make mention of that. Okay, we'll move into consolidation and refinancing. These are 2 terms that get used interchangeably a lot. but they're actually not the same. There are a few key differences that I'll identify right now. So consolidation. What that really means is you're combining multiple federal loans into one new loan at a fixed interest rate based on the average interest rates on your loans that you have. So let's say over a 4-year career at UVA, maybe you have, I don't know, 4 different subsidized loans and 4 different unsubsidized loans. So you had, one of each all 4 years. Year to year, the interest rates will change and the amount borrowed can change. So what consolidation allows you to do, instead of kind of having 8 loans with one loan servicer, you would have 1 loan, 1 payment at an average of the interest rate. There are no additional fees to consolidate your loans. It will not save any money on interest. The main benefit to consolidation is that you're taking all of your loans into one place. You can see everything all at once and make one simple monthly payment. This is also an attractive option sometimes for students that end up going to grad school and have grad plus loans, because sometimes there's a gap in between going to undergrad, maybe working for a few years, and then going to grad school before having loans again. So sometimes that's an attractive option. And if you're interested in consolidation, you can apply for it directly from the student aid website. Refinancing, on the other hand, is combining mostly private loans. You can do federal and private loans together, but in a second I'll talk about why that's not typically a great idea. But refinancing, it's very similar. The difference, though, is when you refinance, you're going through a third-party company. So we've all probably seen like TV commercials or internet ads for like SoFi is a really, really popular student loan refinancing company. So refinancing does have the potential to lower the amount of interest paid over time, because what's essentially happening is they're buying your debt and then you're paying them. So if they buy a few loans for you, they can then lower the interest rate slightly because they went from getting none of your business to all of it, if that kind of makes sense. So it does have the potential to lower the amount of interest paid over time. But if you refinance your federal loans, you lose all protections that are provided. So that's why we say refinancing your federal loans is usually a bad idea, because let's say, actually what's going on right now with the coronavirus and the CARES Act is a really great example, because let's say a year from now, if there was, a second wave of this and they decided to pass more legislation about the interest rates going to 0% and loan payments being frozen and all of that, if you've refinanced your loans, that basically means they're not federal loans anymore. So you lose all of those protections. Same with private loans. If you have private loans right now, none of the things with the CARES Act that I mentioned earlier are currently in effect. Also, if you refinance and then go to graduate school or something like that, the payments will not stop or will not be deferred. So there are some downsides to refinancing your federal loans. Are there any questions about these two things? There's no such thing as a stupid question. If anyone has anything that's kind of nagging at the back of their mind.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned when you go to grad school with a federal loan, the payments can be deferred. Is that just payments and not interest? So it's your loans are still collecting interest while you're in graduate school?
Really great question. So if you had subsidized loans, they will act just like they did in undergrad. So interest will not accrue. If you had unsubsidized loans, or when you're in grad school, if you take out grad plus loans, interest will accrue.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? All right, we're getting close to the end. So I'll talk briefly about delinquency and default. Hopefully these are things that none of you will have to deal with, but still good to know. Delinquency begins the day after the due. We had a question. Yes, Wendy, you do have to work a consecutive 5 years, full years, consecutive full years to be eligible for the teacher loan forgiveness plan. And if afterwards, if you follow the link to it, it actually goes into a lot more detail on like what consecutive years means, and if you have to work a partial year, what that means for you. So if that's something you're interested in, I would encourage you to check that out. But if, let's say you miss a student loan payment somewhere down the road, or if you're short 1 month, you would become what is called delinquent on your loan. So that begins the day after the due date when a full payment has not been made. Loan servicers will begin to prevent you going into default. So part of exit counseling as well is that you have to list references. Sometimes it can be family members or friends, but really it's for this purpose, is if you stop making your loans, they will kind of use your references to get in touch with you if you stop communicating with your loan servicer. So really the key takeaway is if you are worried that you can't make a payment, if you're worried that you're going to be short a month, maybe like right now if you have had a job offer rescinded and you're not sure what you're going to do, your loan servicers will work with you. They don't want your accounts to go into default. They don't want to send you to collections. They absolutely will work with you. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing right now for the coronavirus, but absolutely always please reach out to your loan servicer before it gets to this point. If you're delinquent for 270 days, you will go into default. This is when things get really dicey. Your account will be sent to collections once you're in default. It will stay in your credit report for 7 years, which will make it very difficult to get a house or a car, or sometimes even an apartment. And then you have to go into a whole new process of loan rehabilitation, and that gets a little tricky. So hopefully nobody will have to deal with delinquency or default. So deferment and forbearance. I've kind of hinted at this a couple of times leading up, but deferment is a temporary stop on student loan payments or a reduction of the amount of monthly payments. Students are not responsible for paying interest that accrues during this time. So some of the scenarios that this comes up could be unemployment. It could be an economic hardship, like what's going on right now. Like I mentioned before at the beginning, student loan payments are currently deferred because of the CARES Act. Going back to graduate school, so if you had the subsidized loans in undergrad, or any loan really, payments will be automatically deferred once you enroll, or if you join the US military. There's a couple more examples, but I just picked off the most common ones. Forbearance works exactly the same way. The difference, though, is that students are responsible for paying interest that accrues during this time. So some of the scenarios where your loans can go into forbearance are if you have a medical or dental internship, if you join AmeriCorps, if you're in the teacher loan forgiveness program. I kind of talked about that a second ago with the missed interest and it being treated as taxable income, or joining the National Guard. So there's a long list of reasons for both of these things, and I'll show you where you can find out more information about that. So I do have one more thing that I'll show you, but since we're at the end of the presentation, I wanted to stop and make sure we had plenty of time for questions that might have popped up. Please feel free to, you can just use your microphone and talk or put them in the chat or whatever works best for you. And if you sent me a private question, I haven't forgotten about you. I was just waiting until the end, so bear with me a little longer.